আপনাদের সকলকে আবারও আমন্ত্রণ জানাচ্ছি আমাদের ক্রিমিনাল ল বিষয়ক আইনি অনুষ্ঠান ক্রিমিনাল জাস্টিস প্রোগ্রাম দেখবার জন্য। আমি আজাম কো সলিসিটার্স এর প্রিন্সিপাল সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম এবং আমার সাথে আছেন আমার কলিগ ব্যারিস্টার তারা মেখার্টি। তারা, we will go for the different organizations who have suffered, who have become the victim of this huge fraud. Now, there's a Kingston University, Essex Partnership, NHS Foundation Trust. What happened to them? How much have they lost?
So in terms of Kingston University, they were one of the very many people who were targeted in this. And they lost £1.75 million. But in their particular case, the money was fortunately recovered because the fraud was spotted pretty quickly. But there are lots of other similar types of organisations who've been targeted by these frauds. A lot of different NHS trusts. So North Essex Partnership NHS Foundation Trust was targeted. They lost just under £1 million, of which just over £500,000 was recovered. And then there were various sort of companies in terms of logistic companies, so one based in Solihull in the West Midlands, which was targeted. But it wasn't just them. It was also places like the Royal College of Art, the Royal Free Hospital in Hampstead, St Paul's School in Barnes. You know, lots of different types of organisations which have an element of charitable status to them were the target of these frauds. And it's really been mixed whether the frauds have been successful or not. In some cases, the money gets recovered because it's spotted very quickly. But more often than not, the money isn't recovered in full or none is recovered at all. And as we said earlier before the break, the problem with these frauds is they're sophisticated. The fraudsters know what they're doing. They know how to remove money quickly. And so once you are the target of a fraud like this, it's very often you've got to be quick as a company or an organisation because the money just goes out of the country and you've lost it.
Yeah. And the confiscation proceedings, Tara, it happens after the trial. When the trial ends, then there will be sentencing hearing, maybe separately. And then after the sentencing, there will be a confiscation hearing. And during that hearing, that will be a completely separate one. The judge will set up the timetable.
Yes, that's right. So confiscation and proceedings under the Proceeds of Crime Act, in cases such as this, follow a conviction. So whether you plead guilty, whether you have a trial, if you have made money as a result of your offending, you are liable to confiscation proceedings. And depending upon what the offence is, depends whether in fact it's just the money that you've made from the fraud or from the offence, or whether it's what's called a lifestyle offence, and that the authorities can go back 6 years into your life and say, well, hold on, how have you managed to make this money here and how have you managed to make that money there? And what happens is that the state can look into your background and can make an assertion, which is quite hard to challenge, that you have made money through an illegitimate means. And the definition is broad. So if you don't pay your tax properly, that could come, even though you're not being prosecuted for tax offences, it can form part of confiscation proceedings. And then once they've made an assertion about how much money is the subject of your criminality, which, as I say, depending on the type of offence, can be broader than the actual crime that you're said to have committed or been convicted of, they can look into what assets you've got. Do you own a house? Do you own a business? Do you own property? Do you own shares? Where are your assets? And even if you have bought those assets legitimately, they can be liable to confiscation under the Proceeds of Crime Act if you have benefited from criminal conduct. And so, and all of that process happens once there's been a conviction and sentence normally, because sentence follows normally fairly quickly after conviction, even if there's a report. But confiscation proceedings can take an awful long time, because what happens is normally a different team to the team that's investigated the criminal offence looks into it afresh and makes determinations and assertions about what assets you've got, what's the scope of the criminality, the scope of the financial benefit, and then produces often quite a lengthy report to the court, which you can challenge, obviously. And if you challenge, then there is a hearing where the prosecution say, well, this is how much money was the value of the fraud or the value of whatever offence it is that's caused the loss, and this is what assets the person has. And then what happens is there's these lengthy proceedings, and I've had confiscation proceedings which have often lasted a very long period of time because someone's assets are very complicated, or there are reasons why it just takes ages to find out who's got what and how it's being challenged. And then you have a confiscation proceedings in the court. And again, the longest one I've had was over 11 days, where evidence was called by the prosecution, and then
that's a very long day, isn't it?
It was
11 days for the confiscation. That's a very long days, yeah, for the confiscation proceedings itself.
Yes, yeah. It was, and it was because there was a lot of assets, someone who'd made money legitimately, but also was accused of criminality and convicted of criminality, and then they spent a long time sort of producing evidence as to what was legitimate, what wasn't legitimate, what should have been included in the figure, and so on. So, these proceedings can be very involved and very complex, and that's often the case in fraud, especially if, as I said before, as we said before the break, the principles of frauds and the genuinely devious fraudsters often don't apparently have any assets. They're very good at hiding their own assets, and sometimes the state is able to start getting into, well, where is all this money? Where's it gone? What have you done with it? You keep traveling to a particular country. Have you got assets in that country? And that can take time. And that can also take quite a long time if you have a hearing over that, because people who have hidden money don't normally want to give it up without a fight. And so that's where these proceedings can become protracted. But they are quite important, because it's where some of the monies from these frauds can be recovered. And when you're talking about money being taken from an NHS trust, or from a charitable organisation such as a college of art or a school or whatever, the authorities will fight, the police will fight to try and find where the money has gone, so that it can come back from someone who's stolen it back into its legitimate use.
দর্শক, আপনারা শুনছেন আমার কলিগ ব্যারিস্টার তারা মেখার্তি, উনি যেটা কনফিসকেশন প্রসিডিংসের 11 ডেজ উনি হিয়ারিং করেছেন, ব্যারিস্টার তারা মেখার্তি। তার মানে হলো কি 11 ডেজ এর কনফিসকেশন প্রসিডিংসটা আগে ফ্রড কেসটা তো হয়েছে, সেটা তো আরো অনেক লম্বা সময় হয়তো নিয়েছে, এবং ফ্রড কেসের পরে যে পুলিশ যে একটা ফিগার দিবে যে একটা এত অঙ্কের ফ্রড হয়েছে, 100,000, 200,000, 1 মিলিয়ন, 2 মিলিয়ন, ওইটার উপরে তখন যে ডিফেন্ডেন্টরা, আমাদের ক্লায়েন্টরা, তারা বলে যে না, এটা আমার এত অঙ্কের ফ্রডের হয় না, এখানে আমার বৈধ উপার্জন আছে। তখন একটা কনফ্রন্টেশন শুরু হয় এবং কোর্টের মধ্যে হিয়ারিং হবে যে আসলে পুলিশ যেটা বলতেছে 1 মিলিয়ন বা $500,000 যেটাই হোক, এবং সে বলতেছে আরেকটা ফিগার, লেসার ফিগার। তখন এইটা খুব ড্রাকোনিয়ান আপনার কোর্ট হিয়ারিং হয়, এবং এই যে আমার কলিগ ব্যারিস্টার তারা মেখার্তি যেটা উনি করেছেন 11 ডেজ, 11 দিন 11 ডেজের কনফিসকেশন হিয়ারিং করেছেন, এবং শেষ পর্যন্ত তখন কোর্টের ধার্য করেছে কনফিসকেশন অর্ডারটা কত হবে সেটা। And then you mentioned about the criminal lifestyle. Now talk about that one bit more.
So essentially, what if you're convicted of an offence which falls as is regarded as a lifestyle offence, the authorities can then look back into the past 6 years of your life and ask you to account for every piece of income that's come into your bank account, or that they can show you've dealt with. I mean, normally it's through examining people's bank accounts, and often people find themselves with huge sums of money going through their bank accounts, which they cannot account for. Now, sometimes it can be not related to the principal offending at all. I mean, the classic example is you have someone who gets convicted for drug dealing, but on the side, they are doing cash in hand work, and that cash comes through their bank account. And because they've not paid tax on it, they can't show where it's come from. And in fact, it's not legitimate anyway. And so they end up with confiscation proceedings that not only include the value of the original offence, the value of the fraud or the value of the drugs or whatever the offence is that's a lifestyle offence, but also then go back and include often hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of money transfers going into their account, which they cannot account for. And so you used the word draconian earlier, and that's where this is really draconian and really hard. But at the same time, it is designed really to stop people from benefiting from criminal conduct.
Yes.
And the way that we can do that is by being heavy-handed. And it is noted by the judges that this is draconian and hard, but then their attitude is, well, don't do it and don't offend and don't benefit from criminal conduct. But it is incredibly difficult. And again, you must have had this with cases that you have, I certainly have, where you have someone who starts off with not necessarily a high value fraud or a high value drugs offence, but ends up with confiscation proceedings running into lots of money, because when they investigate their bank account, they can see that they're up to all sorts of things which appear to be criminal and aren't necessarily reflected by a criminal conviction, but are caught by Proceeds of Crime Act proceedings. And so people really need to have their eyes open of the risks that they can run and how these things can escalate or sort of just spiral out of control for themselves if they get convicted of serious offences, and there then are confiscation proceedings which follow.
এই জন্য দর্শক, আপনার যখনই একটা ফ্রড কেসের মধ্যে পড়বে কোনো কেউ, এটা এত গুরুত্বপূর্ণ যে একজন অভিজ্ঞ দক্ষতা সম্পন্ন ব্যারিস্টার এবং সলিসিটরের অ্যাডভাইস নেওয়া এবং এনগেজ করা। তখন আপনার যে বৈধ উপার্জন, আপনি যে সৎ উপার্জন করে যে মানে সম্পদ যেগুলো করেছেন, এগুলো আপনি রাখবেন এবং রাখার চেষ্টা করবে আপনার লয়াররা, আর্গুও করবে সবকিছু পুলিশের সাথে এবং কোর্টে উপস্থাপন করবে যে এখানে তারা যে বলতেছে মিলিয়ন, $500,000 সবকিছু যে ফ্রডের পয়সা, সেটা ঠিক না, এখানে বৈধ উপার্জনের পয়সাও আছে। সো আপনার এই বৈধ উপার্জনের পয়সা রাখতে হলে আপনাকে দক্ষ অভিজ্ঞতা সম্পন্ন ব্যারিস্টার এবং সলিসিটর এনগেজ করার আর কোনো বিকল্প নাই। সো ইউ নিড দ্য স্পেশালিস্ট ব্যারিস্টার অ্যান্ড সলিসিটর to keep your legitimate income so that you can keep most of the what you earned legally.
I mean, yes. I mean, to be honest, anybody who finds themselves being accused of one of these crimes needs representation, needs a solicitor, needs a barrister from the outset, because when you're defending somebody for offences of fraud, you always have in your mind, if they get convicted and if this goes against what they're hoping, that there will be confiscation proceedings. And it means then that you can assist and advise people as to how that will work. And that is the key, because these are incredibly serious. These are long-reaching and have a long-term impact on people, not only in terms of their liberty, but also in terms of their financial security going ahead. And so it's really important that somebody who is facing an allegation, particularly of fraud and significant fraud, understands the potential for what can happen to them if it goes wrong, and can start planning. That doesn't mean they can dispose of the assets, though, because unfortunately, if that happens, that really doesn't help them. But it's more about if something has come into their possession legitimately and they can show it, it's having the time to find that evidence, because confiscation proceedings, unlike with an ordinary criminal trial, it's up to the individual concerned to show where money has come from and why it is legitimate. In criminal proceedings, if you're prosecuted for a criminal offence, you don't often have to prove your innocence. There are some offences where you have to say something, but most of the time, it's the state brings the prosecution. It's the state's responsibility to prove the case against you. When it comes to confiscation proceedings, it's your responsibility to say where that money is, why it is legitimate. And so having representation early on is really key because it helps you prepare and plan.
Yeah. সুতরাং দর্শক আপনারা শুনছেন আমার কলিগ ব্যারিস্টার তারা মেখার্তি যেটা বলছেন এটা এত গুরুত্বপূর্ণ যে আপনার জন্য এত প্রয়োজনীয় যে আপনি আপনার বৈধ উপার্জনের পয়সা যদি রাখতে হয় আপনার অভিজ্ঞতা সম্পন্ন সলিসিটর ব্যারিস্টারের কোনো বিকল্প নাই যারা সে দীর্ঘ আজকে আমি 25 বছর ধরে করতেছি আমি এই ধরনের বড় অঙ্কের আপনার কেসগুলো করেছি এই যে ফ্রড কেসগুলো করেছি এগুলো খুবই টাইম কনজিউমিং এগুলোতে অনেক মানে কাজ করতে হয় ব্যারিস্টারদেরকে এবং অনেকগুলা মানে হিসাব নিকাশ ক্লায়েন্টদেরকে কোঅপারেট করতে হয় আপনার এমন লয়ার দরকার হবে যার সাথে আপনি বসতে পারবেন বসে কথা বলতে পারবেন ডিটেলস বুঝাইতে পারবেন আপনার হিসাব দিতে পারবেন যে কত অঙ্কের পয়সা আপনার বৈধ উপার্জন থেকে আসছে সেগুলো দেখাইতে হবে and then this confiscation Tara also the money held by the relatives like any close relatives the police can go for those people also to recover the confiscation order.
That's absolutely right. I mean, you've got to be very careful because people can transfer money and then they often get accused by the state of trying to hide assets or trying to dispose of assets. So if you are married or if you are in a relationship with someone or if you've got children and you've transferred assets to them or you own assets with them jointly, it doesn't stop them being subjected to confiscation proceedings and being seized by the state. Now, obviously, if the person that you are jointly holding an asset with is holding it lawfully and they're not connected in any way to the fraud, they have rights. And one of the things that we often see in these confiscation proceedings is that people who are the joint owners of a particular asset or a joint beneficiary often aren't legally represented because they sometimes have to pay for it themselves, so it becomes quite expensive. But actually, in some cases, it's worthwhile them being represented because they can have a say too about a particular asset and their voice can be put before the court. But actually, you've got to be very careful. And it's an area that's fraught with danger because people often will transfer assets trying to show that they haven't got an asset. And in fact, that can be caught by the confiscation proceedings and will be. Investigators are normally, from my experience, very thorough. That doesn't mean you can't challenge them, but they are very thorough. So you have to be sensible and logical about how you approach this and how you deal with it. But I think people need to understand that being accused of a fraud and having assets, you can't just give them to your relatives.
Yeah, these investigators not only thorough, they will check on every single item if the criminal lifestyle provision applies, and then also they are very experienced in digging onto the things.
Yeah, I mean, what happens is if you're accused of one of these offences, which then leads to confiscation proceedings, you have to disclose, you are required to disclose all your bank accounts, all of your assets, all of the things you hold, anything which has a value, such as shares, such as high value jewellery. High value jewellery often catches people out because they don't, either they want to try and hide it or they don't actually think that £20,000 ring that they've got is actually part of or has to be part of these proceedings. And so once that happens, the investigators look into this, they confirm whether that's right, that those are all the bank accounts, and then they start to look at, well, what are the transactions? What's legitimate? What can have a provenance, a source of where it's come from, and what actually just appears to be a transfer of the proceeds of crime. And then it's for you as the person who is facing the confiscation proceedings to say, well, actually, this is legitimate. But you saying it often isn't enough. You need evidence of it, of why it's legitimate. And that's often where lots of people struggle, because actually it's the calling of evidence and it's showing the legitimate route if you can, that makes a big difference and can often reduce things. But just saying, oh, well, my mate gave it to me down the, in the supermarket or something like that is not going to work.
Yeah, exactly. And I have seen the police, how did they know? Only police knows how did they get the information. Seized the cash, 100,000, 50,000, people carrying the cash. And then their money has been seized and they have to prove where the money came from.
That's absolutely right. And it's like, if someone gives you £50,000, £100,000, where have you got it from? I'm afraid you've got to be prepared to show, well, where's it come from? And if it came from your great aunt who's just died and part of her estate, well, then there will be a trace. That's something that you will be able to show and prove with documents. Your great aunt died, your great aunt had these assets, your great aunt gave it to you. Then if you want to carry it round in cash, it's quite a risky thing to do, but that's your choice. You can do that, but you've got to show that this money has come from this particular source, and show effectively in a line where it's come from. And that's often where people struggle, because people will often say, oh, well, I got it from my friend or I got it from a relative, and then don't really understand that you say, okay, so can we have the bank account? Can we have a statement from the friend? Because that's what the court wants to hear in order to not find that forms part of the proceeds of crime.
Yeah. Okay, we have gone to that route, confiscation, and then also, the money, cash seizure, all these things. We have to talk about some other organizations that have become the victim of this big Tarlac operation, like Derby University, and I can see the Dundee City Council. How did they suffer? The City Council and then universities?
So the universities, again, in similar ways, Derby University paid out about £300,000 to a legitimate source. It was realised that it was part of this fraud. They managed to recover about 173,000, but the remaining they didn't recover. Lots of other organisations as well, various NHS trusts, various councils. And what's quite interesting is some of the councils were victims and paid out money, sometimes losing all of it, sometimes losing part of it. Other councils just totally ignored the fraudsters. So Falkirk Council was targeted, but in fact they just ignored the request and said they didn't lose any money. And it wasn't just councils, it wasn't just universities, it's also housing associations, again targeted through bogus letters, bogus emails, bogus telephone calls. And it's really interesting how some organisations are able to cope with it and have the structure in place to sort of ignore it, and other organisations, and Lincolnshire, for example, being the first and the worst hit in many respects, responding to it, thinking it's legitimate, being fooled, and handing over the details so that it then means that the fraudsters have got access to that payment, to that transfer, in theory legitimately, which then enables it to go into their bank accounts and then to be just split into different accounts and transferred out of the UK.
Yeah, that is the difficult bit for the police when the money goes offshore to recover the money. That's the way I think most of the money they could not recover.
Yeah, and that's that's quite. I mean, I appreciate this is a particular operation and a particular style of a fraud, but of the frauds that, for example, I've been instructed in, I think almost all of the big cases have involved money going out of the UK and to places like the Middle East or to Eastern Europe, places where it's harder for the authorities to have good communications, which comes back to the point we were talking about earlier. It becomes harder, which is why in this case it was so impressive that the authorities actually did communicate with the authorities in the UK were able to communicate with the authorities in Poland and the authorities in Turkey and the authorities in Dubai and elsewhere in the Middle East. That was what was impressive, because it is not unusual for frauds of this kind to be diverted.
There's a lot to say about this case. I think we finished only half of it. We are out of time now. We have to go for a end of the program now. দর্শক, আজ আমাদের সময় শেষ হয়ে গেছে। আজকের প্রোগ্রামটা আবার কালকে সকাল দেখতে পারবেন আপনারা, সকাল 9:30 থেকে 11টা পর্যন্ত NTV 780 স্কাই চ্যানেলে। তাছাড়া আপনারা NTV ইউরোপের ফেসবুক, ইউটিউবে লগ ইন করলেও প্রোগ্রামের লিঙ্ক পাবেন। সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম এবং আজাম এন্ড কো সলিসিটার্স এই নামে গুগল সার্চ করলেও এই প্রোগ্রামের লিঙ্ক পাবেন। সবাই ভালো থাকুন, সুস্থ থাকুন এবং সকলের প্রতি আমার শুভকামনা থাকলো। আসসালামু আলাইকুম।